in case it wasn't totally obvious by Duncan's claim, we are recording this, so now you've been informed.
No trade secrets, okay?
No, we're not illegally recording you because we've told you about it.
Awesome. All right. Well, I think we have enough folks to kick this off. I'm going to just do sort of some brief updates and introductions, and then I'll pass it over to our guest speaker today. So to start, everybody, thank you for joining us for this meetup. We're super excited about it. It's a really cool topic that's kind of unique for our community as well. So we're pumped to get into it. Before we start, a few things I want to go over. First, this will be our last meetup of 2020. This has been an awesome year. We've seen the community grow. And if everyone can go on mute, that would be great. We've seen the community grow, and it's actually, during the whole pandemic, it's forced us to evolve in a number of ways, primarily making events virtual, which has been awesome. We're seeing people from all over the place join, all different states and countries. So even post-pandemic, whenever that happens to be, we're going to continue this format just because it's been so cool to see it develop this way. A few quick stats on 2020 for the task force. We've had 10 meetups this year featuring awesome guests, CEOs of companies, people running nonprofits, folks in the policy world, lots of cool stuff. We also launched a Slack that has over 250 members now, 100 of which are weekly active users. There's been a bunch of job postings on it, discussion of recent news, collaboration, finding sources for certain data somebody needs, partnership solicitations, a whole bunch of other stuff. In 2020, we also collaboratively submitted comments on our first regulatory proceeding. This was a really cool thing that the community pulled together. It was for the battery storage program docket in Connecticut. And a big shout out to Kyle Haas, who arranged all of that and did an awesome job pulling together everybody's comments and sort of distilling them into one unified thing. And of course, a huge thanks to everybody else who participated in that progress. We hope to do more of that in 2021. A few other things. We have a bunch of meetup recordings on our website, plus all the slides and other relevant information. So feel free to go to the meetup section of our website and browse past stuff we've done. There's kind of a treasure trove there. And then lastly, this year, we launched a podcast to try to bring the discussion that comes through these meetups to a larger audience in a different format that's accessible to different kinds of people. So to wrap up this year, in addition to having this awesome meetup, just like last year, we're doing a little giveaway. Now, last year we gave away a Lego wind turbine. It's not going to be that this year. This year we have, you might have seen our Microgrids Are Dope sweatshirts that we've been selling to raise money for supporting the costs of running this community. We don't have huge costs, but we have a bunch of little things we have to pay for: hosting, Zoom, also editing, all sorts of stuff like that. And so we've been raising just a little bit of money with the sales of these sweatshirts, and we're going to be giving away one for free today. So if you navigate to the chat of the Zoom and go to the very top, the second comment before Sam's is a Google form. Click on that, input your information, and at the end of this meetup, I'm going to use a little script to pick one random contestant to get a free sweatshirt. So make sure you stick around to the end, otherwise you might not be able to claim your prize. So with that, gonna introduce today's meetup. We're super pumped about it. Today we have Caroline, the CEO, COO and co-founder of Oklo. Most of you here probably know, but Oklo is a small modular reactor company. SMRs are tiny nuclear power plants. They promise a bunch of benefits relative to the old school massive nuclear plants that I'll let Caroline describe. But what we think is pretty unique about Oklo is that they're really, really, really tiny nuclear power plants. So much so that we feel they're a DER, a distributed energy resource. So with that in mind, we reached out to Caroline. You know, this system's 1.5 megawatts power it produces. It's intended for distributed installation. This sounds exactly like the sort of thing we tend to talk about. We also felt it was a pretty unique opportunity to bring together two communities that often have some distance between them. Given, you know, Oklo's solution so small, and given our community is, I'd say, pretty open-minded, we're not dogmatic. I'd even go as far as to say we're intellectually rigorous, although that might be a reach. I think this meetup probably couldn't have happened anywhere else. And it seemed like a really novel thing we could kind of pull together here to wrap up this year. One final thing then before handing it over to Caroline, just some logistics on how these meetups work. First, I said it earlier, please go on mute. It can get really crazy in here with this many people if you don't. Second, during Caroline's presentation, if you have some questions, throw them up in the chat. As Caroline's presenting, if one of the DER task force organizers finds a good time to do it, we might jump in and ask Caroline that question. Also, though, at the end of the presentation, we've reserved a bunch of time for Q&A because that's always the most interesting part of these meetups. So at that point, we'll go back through the chat and call on folks who didn't get their question addressed. And we'll give you the chance to, you know, voice it on the Zoom to the group and see what Caroline has to say. Lastly, just please be respectful to everybody, all perspective. Let's not bring any sort of unnecessary animosity, weird gotcha questions. Nothing like that. Let's keep it smart and keep it classy. So with that, Caroline, why don't you introduce yourself and take it away?
Yeah, I will. Thank you so much, Duncan. I really appreciate getting to join this community, present to this community. I'm sensitive to the fact that it's very different, and I'm really excited to learn from you guys. So to Duncan's point, my goal is to do a little presentation. I do have some slides just to give some background and to set the stage. But what I think we're really looking for is the conversation and the questions. And so hopefully I can share a little bit from what I've learned over the years, and hopefully also I can learn from you guys. So you would think after basically a year of COVID, I would be completely fluid in sharing my screen, but I'm going to attempt to go to my PowerPoint and move it to full screen right away. And I will ask you guys if you're seeing it in full screen. Nope. Does that look like just the slides to you guys? Let's try this one more time.
We can see it. Oh, there we go. That's perfect.
There you
Perfect. Go. Okay, great. So yeah, a little bit about Oklo. Basically, we're a small company based in California. We're still just over 20 people working to develop advanced fission, especially on the small scale, what people are calling micro reactors or micro scale fission batteries in order to power remote areas. That's kind of our first plan. Even we're working on now our second design, it's still on that scale. So I think this is right in, like Duncan said, in the spot that you guys tend to look at. So I'll be talking a little bit about that. Yeah, our first product is about 1.5 megawatts electric, and then the second one being on the order of 10. But yeah, we're the first to in fission to raise what we call modern venture-led Series A. So this has typically been an area that's been very reliant on government funding to make it to the next level. Even huge companies like GE or even Bill Gates backed companies have tended to wait for government funding to move forward. And we thought, there's a lot of potential here. Let's just start small, small enough to be venture scale in a size range that's of immediate interest to communities in need, and then go from there. So we were also selected by the Department of Energy to, when we say, demonstrate waste reuse. In other words, turning nuclear waste into clean energy. So basically they have a bunch of material that was previously used in a reactor that we can utilize as fuel for our first demonstration unit. And this year was, in spite of a pandemic, a really big year for us because the biggest challenge in nuclear has broadly been, especially to bringing forward these new technologies that don't look like, and I'll speak a little bit more about this, but don't look like the huge gigawatt scale light water, what are called light water reactor plants. So they, require large amounts of water. They have a certain kind of fuel. They're usually general size. All of the regulations were built for those. And people thought, oh, these advanced technologies, you can't even get it licensed. You can't even get it through the regulator. And we thought, well, let's try. So we actually did work with the regulator for a couple of years, formulated a whole new application structure, got them to kind of agree to it, and submitted it this year and actually had it accepted by the regulator. So it sounds like just a bullet point here, but that of itself was like a big question mark as far as whether some of these advanced technologies could even move forward at all. I had this slide to just show we've been featured in a couple of different things. I think one thing we're excited about is that you'll see several architecture, art related venues. We're really excited about how just the architecture of our building and the incorporation of art on the side of the building has been something that has excited people, and we're hoping will also help communities feel like this power plant can be a part of something that they're proud of, their clean microgrid and whatever makeup it takes on, that we can integrate into that. So I'll also speak to that a little bit, and you'll see the pictures in upcoming slides. I think one question that might be first on your guys' mind, or a lot of people's minds, is, okay, you've got a group of broadly young people that are, straight out of MIT or, Apple or Tesla or whatever, and why do they want to work in this space? Why aren't they going to things that are showing a lot of, like solar has reduced cost dramatically, penetration amazingly, battery storage, and all these other clean technologies? Like, why not work on that, and why work on fission? And so I usually like to start with a couple slides on that, just to say why we think this matters and why we're working in this space. I think one thing that people don't see often is kind of thinking about total life cycle emissions, and that's from cradle to grave, more or less. So including mining and so forth, all the way to storage and disposal. And the best numbers I could find are from IPCC on this, and so I've used this a number of times. If you've watched me and other things, I've used this because I think it is one metric, right? But it is one metric that captures a lot. And I think when we talk about emissions, it's not just about in operation how much emissions is a plant producing, but actually, over its life cycle, you have to mine the materials, you have to dispose of them, you have to do, even wind and solar have certain amounts of construction requirements and so forth. So like, how does it all actually compare? And I think this is a nice, just one of several ways to kind of look at that picture. And you see nuclear power in general is, and this is including the older kind of technologies, is there toward the bottom of total life cycle emissions per kilowatt hour. And so I think that's something we're really excited about, is how you can really reduce emissions for the whole life cycle using fission. And a big part of the reason for why that's possible, next slide, why is it not advancing? There we go. Well, one other kind of way that it's due to energy density, which I'll talk about in the next slide, but energy density also kind of plays out in terms of how much land does it take to produce a certain amount of energy. And nuclear just requires a small amount of land to produce a lot of energy, and it's really because of the energy density of it. It's easier to compare in some ways nuclear versus things that are actually combusted. So here you see sugar, coal, fat, gasoline, things that have essentially calories based on a chemical reaction. Uranium has energy density based on the actual energy inside the atom, right? And so we're fissioning an atom to produce heat and electricity. And the amount of energy you can get out per fission compared to per reaction for, say, fossil fuels is millions of times more energy dense. So not only is it obviously cleaner than fossil fuels, but a thing we're really excited about is just how much more energy density it has. And the reason why we think it has so much potential is it requires so much fewer materials to produce electricity than any other energy source by millions of times, it should have that potential. And what's really held it back is an array of reasons, really. You can't just pick one, but a big part of it is how certain things have been implemented. So we really see this potential. And here I'm saying fast fission. It's, if you're going to boil down everything that's different about us into one term, you might use the term fast fission. But just as an introduction, basically the technology we're using is similar to conventional nuclear plants, only in the sense that we use fission. We're far smaller, right? We're on the order of a megawatt instead of a gigawatt. We use a different type of fuel. They use ceramic fuel, we use a metallic fuel that has certain safety benefits. We use a different energy spectrum. Even the neutrons that are moving around are moving at different speeds such that they're in a totally different spectrum. And that's what enables us to consume waste. We don't require water as coolant. And in fact, don't require much in the way of water at all, which really changes how siting and environmental impacts look. And all these things and more. So if you look at it from top to bottom, we're a different size. We use a different coolant. We have a different fuel. And so the only thing that's really similar is fission, but we do believe in the possibilities for that. So why are we using fast fission? More or less the plants you see around the country and around the world stopped development basically in the 1970s. People are always shocked when I say, like, if you wanted just one data point to get a sense for how backwards this industry is and remains is, well, I'll give two. One is that there's not a commercial nuclear power plant, at least in the United States, that uses digital controls. So when people are talking about like, oh, what if cyber terrorists hacked into nuclear plants? It's honestly kind of funny because they're literally, you know, basically using dials and buttons and things that are not digital. And another one is that frequently quality assurance is done through paper. Actually, when we were looking at implementing modern quality assurance using electronic records, electronic data, and so forth, which we believe is much superior, people were like, are you sure you want to use electronic records? So it was hard to even find a quality assurance person familiar with the space that was also familiar with modern methods. So basically, these things are stuck in time. But between the 1960s and the 1990s, there was actually really good research done on fast fission. And in fact, there's a plant with very similar characteristics, similar fuel and coolant to what we're developing that took the experimental power plant, which is actually bigger than ours, had it at full power, shut off all the cooling, and it had no damage to it. And if you're going to summarize maybe a big part of the safety, the reason why it has that safety characteristics, it's almost as simple as we're using metal fuel. The metal, when it heats up, expands and expands enough that the density goes down such that the reactions aren't occurring to sustain it. So it essentially can't overheat and cause meltdowns, and it doesn't require quite as many safety systems in order to assure that safety. It's just baked into the physics of the system. So it's been demonstrated, but basically around the 1970s, a lot of the technology implementation just stopped. The incredible interest rates and failures in construction and nuclear in the 80s really hindered interest in it. And in fact, there hasn't been a nuclear power plant built and operated, started operations that actually started with its application submitted to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission as it is now, which started in 1974. If, you know, once it turns on, Vogtle would be the first one. And of course, maybe some of you are familiar with the fact that there were supposed to be others, but they were canceled. So these large, we're seeing, and you guys know very well, better than me probably, how grids are, you know, utilities are moving from wanting to own generation to wanting to own distribution. Things are becoming more and more distributed. Large power plants are generally a thing of the past. And I think these kinds of technologies can integrate really well with the grid of the future. So what are we developing? The first plant that we actually have the application into the NRC right now is called the Aurora Powerhouse. Some fast facts. So yeah, like Duncan said, between 1 and 2 megawatts electric, generally we say 1.5. And I'll explain, there's a little bit of a reason why it can vary. So it has a 20-year fuel lifetime. So from the time you fuel it to the next time you have to fuel it is literally 20 years. So that it gives a lot of reliability for communities that may have fuel supply challenges or disruption. And of course, one of the key examples of this, and one of the first places we expect to build, is actually in Alaska and different areas where they experience a lot of energy poverty, or they're burning a lot of diesel power, and sometimes may have to burn many gallons of diesel fuel for every gallon they actually receive and consume for power production. So it's nice in that sense. It's also nice in a security sense too. You can have a large security force there while the fuel is being put in underground and locked up. But between then and 20 years from then, the idea is it's not taken out, it's not accessible, it's underground, and it's very secure. We call it an advanced fission battery with solar, and the reason is I'll go back to the previous slide. So here you can see, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but there's stripes that are essentially solar panels, and it's not super obvious in the graphic, but those aren't just reflecting the sky. Actually, it's we went through MIT Clean Energy Prize actually with a company called Sistine Solar, and we've always been kind of inspired by how they wanted to integrate power and kind of art or something beautiful. And they still produce solar panel skins. Granted, it reduces the efficiency a little bit, but we like the idea of literally showing on our building that you can use multiple different types of power production. And I think it's become a major thing that we talk about is how we could have different skins on the solar panels at each site, and it could be kind of from a community artist, or the community could vote on it. For this concept art, we actually used an image taken by NASA that has image, you can't really tell from this graphic, but basically it's a picture of the Earth. And so you can kind of see that half circle with the stars above and lights on the ground, as well as Aurora kind of between them. And Aurora is obviously the name of our power plant. So that's all part of our story, is showing that integration and integrating community art to it. We do call it a fission battery sometimes, just because, like I said, like everything is different about us from a typical nuclear power plant, such that sometimes it helps people think of it in terms of a battery. You fill it up for 20 years, it produces power in a very simple way. It doesn't require active operations and has a lot of simplicity to it like that. So we've used that term, not to try to confuse people, but it can sometimes be a useful kind of mind shift. Also just the size being so small at a megawatt, roughly a megawatt. So we can utilize waste. So that's an exciting thing. And from when we very first started, that was part of our goal, is to utilize existing waste and turn it into energy. But we didn't think until more recently that we would actually be able to do that with our very first of a kind, which we're so excited about. Natural forces move heat. We don't use water pumps, valves, or moving parts to keep the reactor cool. That's part of the kind of what we call inherent safety that I was talking a little bit about with the technology. And portions inside the powerhouse can be used as a meeting ground for community members. When we're talking to people in Alaska, one of the things they were talking about is just having meeting space that's lit and warm. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but in some of these more remote areas where we were talking to people, that's a thing in the wintertime. And they're, having to make decisions based on the cost of electricity, as far as, if they're going to use it for heat or use that money for food and all kinds of those kinds of stories that are very heart-wrenching, honestly, to hear. Certainly, we wanted the front part of the building to be something that could be accessible as either a meeting space, or just for people to realize, hey, this is not something you have to be afraid of or walk far away from. You can actually utilize it. You can go inside. There could be like a little museum or visitor center there. So that's not something that has to be kept away from the public. Another thing we've talked about is, in installations for this, coupling it with a building nearby somewhere with like a swimming pool. So warm water and exercise is a challenge in winter months in some of these areas as well. We've used this data, and I realized one time someone asked a question that I needed to clarify it, but each unit saves 1 million tons of CO2 over the lifetime compared with diesel alternatives. And that's including basically recycling the fuel. So each time we use that fuel for 20 years, it actually still has a good amount of life in it, such that we can keep recycling it over and over for multiple deployments. So over about 80 years or so, or 4 or 5 different deployments, that fuel could actually save that amount of CO2 compared with the diesel alternative. I think I'm doing a little long on time, so I'll try to speed up the next slides without talking too fast. Here's a brief kind of timeline of where we've been at Oklo. We started work with the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which is the agency we have to get regulated through. We started that in 2016. Also in 2016, we demonstrated making fuel prototypes for ourselves. We also did thermal testing with another national lab in 2018. In 2019, we got a site use permit from the Department of Energy for a site in Idaho. We also were awarded in early 2020 that fuel that I mentioned, so that we could demonstrate reuse of fuel material. A lot of times people in the nuclear community don't want to call it waste, so they say demonstrate reuse. But I think for most people, they think of that as nuclear waste. It would otherwise have to be stored as nuclear waste. And so I continue using that word, even if it's probably not the preferred word there. We submitted our modernized application for a new technology, and then in June, the NRC accepted it. And in the early 2020s, we're expecting to be deploying the first of our powerhouses. So just a few more slides. Oklo powerhouses are supposed to have a broad set of applications. It's been interesting as we've kind of launched and talked to different potential customers who comes to us and who's interested. I think, the obvious first answer is off-grid and remote communities, and that's who we've been kind of working with, is small utilities that serve these types of communities, but also data centers, any kind of campus, so hospital campus, resorts, military base, universities have been interested. Of course, different industrial facilities or resource production sites. One of our earliest potential strategic investors was interested because he had a chromium mine in Canada, and of course extraction, that they have power needs, and maybe surprisingly many of them are trying to decarbonize, so that's kind of exciting. And then of course developing areas around the world. I'll never forget being at an international conference and having different representatives from countries in Africa, and one of which being from Ghana, and asking the question to someone else who was there for the nuclear industry and saying, I don't have $1 billion. What if we want this kind of reliable power for my area? And he's like, well, it doesn't exist. And I was like, oh, I'm here. But I wasn't the presenter at that session. But I think we're seeing a lot of developing countries, developing areas want to see what we always say, reliable, clean, and affordable power for their area, maybe as a complement to what they've already started with, like renewables such as solar and wind. Maybe they also need resources like this in order to power at night, or to provide more resiliency to their grid. So yeah, those are all potential exciting things. I know I mentioned, but corollary to the energy density is actually having the lowest needs for raw materials for any energy source in order to produce a kilowatt hour. That should mean it could be cost effective. Also, the capacity factors for nuclear are impressive. Generally, the fleet in the United States is actually not just over 90%, but over 95% capacity factor, so very high uptime. And that's important for a lot of these remote communities that may not have other sources or other grids to kind of plug into or trade with. And yeah, once we get to the place where we're really just demonstrating a solid recycle reuse system, it looks like a renewable. And I say that being curious or concerned about what the thought might be from this community. But I think what's really exciting is the amount of nuclear waste we have in the United States alone could power the United States entirely for 1,000 years emission free. So we have an outrageous amount of energy out of it. so much so that in all of our lifetimes and our many kids lifetimes, could be powered entirely off of it. And that's actually the only solution for nuclear waste is to reduce the lifetimes of the storage of it, is to utilize it. And so that's a big part of what we think could lend to affordability, is to turn something that's currently a liability to store safely and instead turn it into clean electricity. So that actually segues into this, which I think is my last slide. So we can actually recycle fuel, and generally we can do it using a simpler, for those who are familiar with reprocessing, there's a lot of concern about separating out different materials for proliferation concerns, but we can actually do this utilizing a more simple melt and recast method. In other words, we melt down the fuel, remove some things without doing separations, and then add additional fresh fuel, cast it back up and send back out. So again, utilizing this kind of melt recast method to recycle and really get a lot more energy out of the fuel than is currently done. So existing plants may use on average a few percent of their the energy that's in their fuel, and with fast fuel recycling, you can get to incredible percentages, but conservatively, over 60% of the energy that's in the fuel could be utilized. So it's many more times, and that's good for the planet, and it's good for cost efficiency as well. So we're excited about decarbonizing communities and being part of a grid that does that. We can hopefully mitigate climate change impacts. I will say, for a lot of us in mainland United States, or my understanding is there's people around the world here on this conference call, but we sometimes don't think about that. But literally when we were in Alaska, there's communities that are already looking to move their entire community due to impacts of climate change. So for them, it's a real themselves to have something that it isn't a further contribution to this concern that they already have about climate. And so one thing real quick, we're doing load following is possible at this small size through battery storage inverters. So that's the main way we look at actually doing very quick and integrated load following. We can even, utilizing that, go above our total capacity in short bursts, right, using these battery storage inverters, which is our main method for integrating with local grids as well. I thought I had one more slide. Yeah, so that's it. Hopefully not too much of a brain dump, and hopefully clear. I'm excited to hear your guys' questions, and hopefully I touched on enough topics to lay enough groundwork for some good discussion.
Awesome. Caroline, thank you so much. And yeah, if you want to just exit the screen share, then we'll be able to folks who ask questions. I thought I'd just kick it off. There's a bunch of good questions here, but one sort of foundational one that I think will just help us kind of understand what Oklo is doing. I've heard about the benefits of SMRs over kind of traditional nuclear projects and project development. Could you kind of crystallize that for me? Like this kind of thesis of manufacturability versus mega projects, like what does that all mean really?
Yeah, I'm going to rephrase your question, make sure I'm answering it correctly. So what do we see as the kind of differences in how you commercialize a small project versus a large one?
I guess, yeah. And, I think a lot of people see SMRs as kind of the antidote to some problems we've had with deploying larger nuclear plants. And like, why is that? Why smaller useful?
Yeah.
Well, Duncan, sorry, it's just like it's a supply chain question too, right? Like another big issue is just sort of the scaling, economies of scale in manufacturing. Like if sort of having a one prototype that's repeated many times, like can you actually drive down the costs of kind of the constituent parts and manufacturing of the kind of the reactor in general, right? Because there's just like not enough demand globally to drive manufacturing costs down right now. So if it's kind of helpful on that front.
Definitely. Yeah. No, it's great. Yeah, there's kind of two pieces to it, the actual construction and how do you do supply chain, I guess. You could almost break it down like that. I think on one hand, on the supply chain for existing large plants, it doesn't even really exist, at least in the United States anymore, in many cases. So for instance, they have huge what's called reactor vessels, and so they're made of steel, and even just the foundries that used to be able to be capable of making cylindrical vessels of that size don't exist in the United States anymore. So they have to get it from Japan, and they have to have special barges, and it's a whole logistical thing just for that one component. And you can see how I think there's a lot of talk in the nuclear industry about how we change it from being a large infrastructure project to being more like a manufacturing project, right? Like you're saying, like, can you make it mass produced and the parts are interchangeable, and they have those benefits. Every plant in the United States, every nuclear plant in the United States is a one-off. So not a single one of them is the same. They might use similar technologies, but each plant ended up, for various reasons, is my understanding, ending up being different enough that not a single one is similar enough to really have any kind of real supply chain. So yeah, I think that's a real challenge for how the industry looks at it. I think whenever you look at large infrastructure projects, and there's other people that do this better justice than me, they end up going over budget. You look at like the Bay Bridge, or you look at the Big Dig in Boston, or any kind of huge construction project. It's just a logistical nightmare, and much more vulnerable to all kinds of different things that may go on during the life of the project, for causing delays, even if you have contingencies. And so I think the idea is, what if it's all more or less indoors? You could mass produce it. So I think that's a big part. I don't think we ourselves lend quite as much of our cost benefit to that concept. I think a lot of people say like, oh, let's mass produce it and we'll get economies of scale, and just stop there and say like, there's the answer. And how do you get to that though? And what motivates people to purchase your product before you get to this cost of scale? And I think the typical nuclear industry answer would probably be, well, governments should subsidize us till we get to that point. And I think from our point of view, we just basically disagree with that scenario. I'll be a little further inflammatory. I think you look at groups like NuScale, which would be considered a SMR, which in the United States became almost a euphemism for small light water reactors, and not what we're calling advanced fission. So like non-light water reactors that use different technologies. They would be the key example. And I think, and I should know, but I know they've spent over $1 billion, and about half of that's been US government subsidized. But when you really look at them, in theory, each reactor is itself, and it's changed, and it's gone up, which is good for them. It's gone from like 50 megawatts to 60 to I think even 70 now, I heard more recently. But when you look at the 12 pack, which is what they've actually licensed, so all of their safety systems have to do with a whole 12 pack. So multiply 60 megawatts by 12, and then you're starting to look at closer to hundreds of megawatts, getting closer almost to that gigawatt number. I think what they were looking at is replacing kind of existing coal plants, and certainly that would be wonderful if coal plants get replaced with clean generation that has even better capacity factors. But I think they're looking at the same challenges of large infrastructure projects. The pool that they require, the cooling pool basically for those 12 pack of reactors, is a larger pool, is my understanding, than has ever been constructed in the history of the world, and would have to be what's called safety related. So it would invoke a really high level of quality assurance. Our goal, so what we've looked at, and I'm sorry, this has been a long answer, but it's kind of a complex question you're asking. What we've looked at to kind of reduce our costs is really focusing on what does have to be safety related. How can we make it as safe as possible without having to rely on outrageous standards of quality assurance? In other words, can it be inherently safe, reduce the number of safety related components, and be smarter about how we do quality assurance using electronic records, using modern technology to design, to optimize, and to do quality assurance. And so I think that's where we see our cost savings, along with actually the recycling of fuel and turning the current liability of waste into a valuable product. The biggest single cost driver for us is fuel. So we're very hesitant to put out cost numbers. Like, people are always like, well, what's your cost per kilowatt hour? And we've always been hesitant to just, I think a lot of people are like, oh, we can get down to this cost or that cost. And we've said numbers we think we can get down to. But I think ultimately what it comes down to is what fuel costs. And once we have really realized that we need to fully integrate that fuel facility, I think our cost is coming much more into view. I would say the corollary to that is, if you hear companies throwing out numbers with absolute certainty for fuel that you can't even buy on the market today, maybe take it with a grain of salt.
Awesome. That was a super detailed answer. So another,
I guess.
Oh,
sorry. Go ahead. No, I was going to piggyback off it. Go ahead.
I was going to move to the next question in the chat. So if you have anything
just like one more related note on cost that I think, without like a specific number, I guess in general, is there an expectation that SMRs will be lower in like the kind of nameplate cost of larger reactors, or higher? Like, do all these things coming together, do you think on like a per unit cost basis, it could actually drive costs down, or will it be like par? Will it be like, is that the benchmark are you going for, or
no,
just
it's a
in
great
general?
question. I should have gone just a little further. I'll say a huge difference between Oklo and every other company that I'm aware of. And to be clear, there's kind of these developers making designs that they're hoping to sell it to utilities. So, and then the utilities would charge whatever rates they charge, and they're hoping to get utilities to buy things. And I think they're hoping to get the government to subsidize their development cost and or subsidize the purchase and construction from the utility side, or both. Our business model is to develop and own and operate. So the costs would be on us. We're not passing that off. I think a legitimate concern of a lot of people has been like, oh, nuclear is really expensive, and then they pass that off to the consumer. And the key for us is we want to save people money in whatever market we're going to. I'll say like our first of a kind of costs, we're looking at around 20 cents a kilowatt hour, which is obviously high. That's why we're looking at these other markets at the same time. And granted, this is retail. Here in California, at my home, I spend 25 cents a kilowatt hour, and at our office, we spend about 33. So I know it's retail and there's a difference there, but I will say that, it's becoming more and more grid competitive depending on where you look. And that's our very first of a kind. We're expecting by like 5 to 10 getting much lower, and especially once we basically have our fuel facility up and running. But we're not charging, our cost direct to the consumer. We're basically working with different utilities, seeing how much money we can save them, seeing where the match is. And basically the proposition always to them is they, through power purchase agreements, purchase power from us at a price that makes sense to them, that hopefully that will save them money. And the amount of money they save may depend on certain factors. And then we are owning and operating. So they're not having to buy the reactor, they're not having to own the waste, they're not gonna have to deal with the disposal, and all that's all that risk is taken on by Oklo.
Really interesting that you're doing, you're owning the plants yourselves. And I have a bunch of questions about that, but I want to get to the chat questions. I don't want to starve the community. Allison Kubo, you had a question about heat. Do you want to jump on and ask it?
Yeah, hi, my name is Allison Kubo. I was just thinking that one of the biggest advantages of nuclear is that it does produce heat, which of course coal burning does, but that's not very good. And so we can hopefully get to the point where you could use the heat directly produced by fission reactions for district heating, or importantly, industrial heating of smelting. And I wondered if you could expand on this idea, and if these small modular reactors would be able to do that.
Yeah. Allison, you're hitting on something that's really important and frequently forgotten. I was actually at a clean energy ministerial in Copenhagen a couple years ago, speaking on the topic of decarbonizing industrial emissions. And that's honestly a tricky problem generally, but if we could utilize these for that, it could be an elegant solution. Yes, we've looked at, actually that same person I was mentioning, that a chromium mine, he actually was interested in heat for 2 of his 3 interested products. So, right, he wanted electricity, but he also wanted actually heat to heat the mine because it's cold. It's up in Canada, and steam for, he had kind of like a little building community that already had steam infrastructure as well as the electricity. And so we've gotten that interest since early on, and you're really hitting on a great point. We've done some studies with the University of Alaska at Fairbanks looking at how can you best kind of modulate to the extent you need to, or model typical cycles for a community during a day. So between their steam needs and their electricity needs, and how could you best kind of alternate between the two, or optimize that. So that's kind of an interesting thing we've been looking into. I will say that the most interest we've seen though is just still electricity, and they've thought, well, if we need it for heat, we'll utilize electricity for heat, and that's kind of how it's looked so far for our potential like first movers. But I will say that that's like a close second where people are interested in that. And we've also looked at the heat production being utilized as kind of like a combined product for coupling with, like we met a group that does actually kind of modular containerized desalination plants, and how cool would it be if you had like a modular desal plant coupled with one of our generators, coupled with, you get electricity and clean water. When you get enough clean and energy dense electricity, and as long as the costs add up, there's wild things you can do, right? You could literally pull fuel from the air, essentially by pulling carbon out of the air and doing certain processes to turn it into fuel. So it's really wild what you could do, basically self-supporting a community, like, or base or whatever, off of the power that you can produce. So you're really right with that. I wouldn't say it's gone super far. Generally, the regulator, and this is the last thing I'll say, is structured to regulate electricity production. So they literally have part of their NEPA requirements, which everything has this, NEPA. I don't know how familiar you all are with that. I assume you are. Environmental Protection Act reviews for nuclear plants fall to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and one of their first things is even questioning whether there's a need for power in the first place, and power has always been defined by electricity. And so even that's been a little bit of a challenge, trying to reformulate how the regulator looks at that. It's like, look, it might be more than just electricity. It might not even be electricity. How are you going to look at that? And so they're still thinking about that. For our first of a kind application, we just stuck with electricity, but you're really, yeah, it's a great point.
Awesome. Another one in the chat, which is refreshing and interesting because most of our questions are super nerdy, but this one's more general interest. Cece, are you still there? You had a question about leadership?
Cece had to run, but I think you should ask the question because it's good.
All right, I'm just going to quote Cece. Sorry, Cece, I'm stealing your question here. She asked, how have you managed as a leader introducing innovation to an industry that prides itself on keeping things the same?
Yeah, that's boy, that cuts to the heart of me, man. I think like our biggest challenge every day is like trying to keep like our morale up while living inside of an industry that's fundamentally kind of opposed in some ways to what we want to do. And I will say, like, at the same time, to the extent, this is being recorded and people might watch this from that industry, I think there's many people within it that would say that they're very supportive, but I think many times they've looked at our proposals and denigrated or thought we're going too far, or that we're too young to know what we're doing. Never mind that, like we're in our 30s and, different ages inside our company, of course, and working with all kinds of different ages of investors. I think in this industry where the average age has frequently been around, like all my professors at MIT were like in their 60s and 70s. There's a big gap between those people and kind of the younger people entering the field because they're excited about the carbon-free implementation of nuclear power because of environmental issues. So it's almost an inverse between people who went into it decades ago and the people go into it now and their motivations for why they went into it. So yeah, trying to do things differently has been a challenge. Sometimes I've wondered what kind of like things we can look to. I think like, maybe it sounds cliche, but I wonder how like Tesla dealt with like, I don't know, the big three, when they're like, yeah, we're gonna do this and it's gonna become normal. And they're like, no one even wants to buy that right now. And they're like, no, we think people do, and we want to do it this way. And there's a lot of like inside of an industry, you have like standards and protocols, and people with decades of experience have been developing these over decades. And we're just kind of like, yeah, we think that's outdated. We want to do it differently. And I think there's a lot of pushback on that in general. So it's been a really big challenge. And then I think we face kind of like that challenge within the industry, but then for people outside the industry who have their own challenges with nuclear power in general, or their misconceptions or their anger at what it has meant in the past, maybe don't see what it could be for the future, and maybe they have good questions, maybe they don't, but you kind of have to take it from both sides. And then coupling that with dealing with the regulator has been a challenge. Not to say you guys should pity us, but it's a real challenge. And it's like trying to, I'll say this in a practical sense. I think where it hit us the most is trying to find the right kind of talent. And how did we find talent that weren't too kind of jaded by this industry, but know just enough to contribute, right? Because we need nuclear engineers. Like at the end of the day, we can't just do this with like business people and environmentalists who think it's cool. Like we have to have nuclear engineers that have had some experience, but hopefully are not too jaded by how it was done in the past. And so largely our talent has come straight out of school and has been trained up in a new way or worked only a few years. Now that we've established our own precedent, we're able to actually kind of hire in people with more and more experience because we've already kind of established our company culture and established some precedent that's now recognized industry-wide. But I think early on that was a real challenge.
You know what, something related to that, another question in the chat that touches at something you were mentioning. Matt Kirsch, you had something on policy and market changes and regulation.
Sure. So I was just kind of curious if you think there are key changes in mind for certain markets, maybe in different areas, or key policies that you would like to see to support, I guess, much greater growth.
Yeah, I think, yeah, it's a challenging question. Here's why. I think a lot of people, when they hear about the potential, when they hear like, oh, there's these technologies that actually got completely proven out, they're not even new. Why hasn't this been done before? Or they kind of learn a little bit about it, and they're like, there's all these young people excited about it. There's all these changes like globally where people care more about climate and carbon. And there's this impetus now, like it's becoming a major political movement. Why isn't some of the policy or some of the regulations catching up to that? Maybe there's a quick kind of silver bullet regulatory or policy fix. It's like a good and a bad thing. We've got really honestly great bipartisan support of advanced nuclear right now. So advanced fission specifically has bipartisan support. People on the right like it because of resiliency and I don't know, American preeminence, keeping up with that. And then people on the left like it because of climate and caring about the environment and all the kind of usual things that kept, honestly, the left away from traditional nuclear power decades ago. So it's really cool to see like bills just get passed that are trying to support advanced nuclear, just bipartisan, unanimously passed or through committee. At the same time, there's kind of not this quick fix because there's all this regulatory kind of inertia from decades that just takes time hashing it out. Like we can't just go to Congress and be like, tell the NRC to like not do anything the way they're doing it now necessarily. The NRC is Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And people have, and to an extent, Congress has told them they need to do things differently. And I think that's what's given them a bit of a motivation to even accept our application or even look at a technology like ours. But at the same time, we're still having to hash out every single little issue one by one. And I don't think like Congress doesn't have the patience to look at that. Like regulations say you have to have X number of operators and you have to have X number of like security personnel walking around the plant, and you have to have this kind of system to protect against this thing. And it doesn't even make sense in this kind of system. And, or it's, you know, it requires like this kind of emergency planning for this size of community. And it's like, well, we're not even going to be in a town of that size. And our total number of people working at the plant is like 2. And the total size of the plant is like a house. And so like, it's just all different. And so we're having to still kind of fight the little battles. I will say though, like to your point, like broadly, the policy support that we're seeing does make a difference. I think it really does. And even though all those little battles still have to be kind of hashed out, the Regulatory Commission, knowing that Congress and people want to see this now, like they're seeing many more callers in to our public meetings talking about how they want this versus how they don't want it. And I think that plays into how they look at things instead of delaying. And I think they should have seen, if not a single plant has been built since the Regulatory Commission started, that started under the Regulatory Commission, they need to change something. Otherwise, they're basically just ensuring that people aren't getting cleaner, safer power instead of, you know, actually doing their job. So I think all of those things are huge. I'll say one last thing. I think there's some really cool kind of left-leaning, climate-oriented think tanks that are putting out papers talking about how all of these different energy sources can be part of a new clean grid and the role that different regulatory agencies play in that in the future of our environment. So I'm excited about that.
Thank you.
Caroline, do you mind? I mean, it's 7:01. Do you mind a few more minutes? We had just a couple other great questions.
Yeah, definitely. I think I owe it because I've been taking so long with each question.
No, that's great. All right, so Spencer Fields, you had a question about ramping.
Let's see if I can find that mute button. Yeah. So thanks so much. My name is Spencer Fields. I work in solar, but previously worked in other energy type issues. And one of the questions that I had was just around the ability of the Oklo units. And sorry, I typed Oslo. I'm not sure if that's a Freudian slip that I want to go there, or just a standard typo. But I'm curious about the way that the units are able to ramp to meet demand and match generation and output to demand, or whether it's a sort of consistent power output. What, you know, how does it function and meet the load at the Aurora house facility?
Yeah, I might just throw in there, like in my mind, it's relevant not just because, you know, on some future grid where things like wind and solar are part of the grid mix too, so we have to ramp. But if you're looking at remote communities, just load changes and you got to follow load. So that's really interesting to me. Yeah.
So there's kind of two complementary things that we can utilize there. Fundamentally, the reactor itself, because it's using that, what we call fast fission, it can actually ramp up and down incredibly quickly. So in the matter of seconds. I will say like the power conversion system and other things kind of change that, but it's very different from existing plants. And I will say some existing plants, like in France, they actually successfully load follow slowly throughout the day. I want to say up to 30%. So they actually do that on a daily basis, ramping up slowly, ramping down slowly, on the order of 30% of power production a day up and down. One of the things that limits, and I'm going to get really nerdy here really fast, hopefully, light water reactors from load falling quickly is because they actually produce what's called a poison. And so if you build up too much of that poison, you actually can't ramp up again quite as quickly. So it kind of limits the amount of ramping you can do. That poison doesn't affect fast fission. So that's part of why it's just fundamentally different from existing plants. But because we're using the battery storage inverters, basically that is able to integrate with the grid in a much similar way, is my understanding, and this is not my forte, I'll say, to how like renewables and many other power plants can kind of connect to the grid and very rapidly load follow and smooth power to the grid, and even respond rapidly, as well as even accommodate surges that are even beyond our capacity for limited periods of time. So up to 150% of our capacity we could hit using those battery storage inverters for shorter periods of time. So my understanding is like maybe on the order of minutes to an hour utilizing those. So I hope that answers the question. If it doesn't, please stop me.
No, very helpful. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. There are some questions in here about fuel and waste and where you're sourcing it, but it seems Rod gave a pretty good answer to one of them. There's one about, I assume fuel, but I understand about half of the words. It's from Mike Maruka. Mike, do you want to just jump on? Because I couldn't even attempt to do that justice.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Mike. I'm a lawyer, work on renewable energy stuff. And I was wondering how you sort of fit into the current framework of managing liability from nuclear accidents, where, you know, the government set a limit, and then everybody can just sort of join forces and self-insure all together, and everybody ends up spending maybe $1 million a unit in that extra insurance costs, but ultimately they are subsidized by the government in case of an accident. So I was wondering how the fuel piece is sort of separate, risk of transporting highly enriched uranium, but I was wondering about if you're faced with trying to establish a whole new framework for managing your liability from an accident, since it wouldn't seem to fit very well into like a 3 Mile Island type of scenario.
Yeah, that's a great and really complex question. To start, I think one problem I think the industry has over and over again is naming things that confuse people. So HALEU sounds like high enriched, but it's actually still low enriched. And so in that sense, it still fits below that boundary given. I'm sorry, my dog has started whining. It's walk time. So it's still below that 20%, which was set, years ago for various reasons. Honestly, it's an arbitrary limit, right? Like nothing magical happens at 20%. That being said, that is a reason why people want to stay below that, is because it remains defined as low enriched. Although it's at the higher end of what's defined as low enriched, it really doesn't change a lot of different protocol. There's been a lot of questions around how Price-Anderson affects insurance, and honestly not very much for advanced reactors, because not many are really serious about buying insurance other than us. And we're still just starting to really talk to insurers about how they'll look at this kind of risk. I will say that the insurance companies the insurers that insure this kind of risk have a gravy train. They've never once paid out, and they make incredible margins. And so they want to insure more nuclear risk. And so they've advocated for basically Price-Anderson to go away, and so that they can insure more of what they call the tails risk. So it is interesting. It's kind of a double-ended sword for, I think, the industry, because people utilize it and say, well, the industry is getting a subsidy at the same time as it's never really been paid out, is my understanding, other than maybe like 3 Mile Island. So it's how would it be used in our case? That's tough to say. It's tough to even understand if insurers are going to understand what our safety case is. So I'll give one example. Our worst case accident doesn't even release any dose at all. No dose. So how do we ensure that? We're required by law to insure it. How will they look at that? What kind of premiums will they assess to us? It's very interesting. Because of our size, though, we are already below the limits that are required. And this is, I believe, regulatory, not related to Price-Anderson, but it's actually, there's some requirements for plants to enter what's called a secondary retroactive pool. So if there's any accident anywhere, all nuclear plants all have to pay in to help pay for that. We're actually below the size that are required for that, which is reasonable, I think, and appropriate, because some large gigawatt light water reactor had some accident. Why would Oklo necessarily, as a small, totally different design, have to pay into that, especially because we're 1 megawatt and our revenues would be much smaller, and so forth. So it's an interesting and complex question. I actually like the insurance question, but it's basically, I don't have a lot of answers for you.
Cool. Well, there's a few others, but they've either been nearly covered or I think just would go down a rabbit hole we might not have time for, us being a little bit over. So unless anybody really has anything that's they're itching to get an answer for, I think we're going to call it here. In the meantime, Caroline, is there any last thing you want to say to a group of folks that probably aren't sitting in front of you learning about nuclear very often?
I think the questions were great, and I was able to hit on like quite a wide variety of topics. I'd love to keep the conversation open, and if anyone thinks of something later, feel free to send me an email. It's pretty easy to remember. It's C as in cat at oklo.com. So, or C as in Caroline at oklo.com. So pretty short and easy to remember if you want to send me a follow-up note or any questions that you think about later. Yeah, I honestly, it's great to just hear your guys' questions, especially I don't get the chance to talk to people with this expertise on average. So appreciate your time as well.
Awesome. Yeah, well, thank you so much for joining us. And then everybody stick around for 1 second. We've got the drawing, the free raffle. Just pulling it up now. All right. So we've had, looks like 16 people submit. And I'm going to hit the button now. All right. Allison Kubo, you are our winner of this year's raffle.
Woo! First question and sweatshirt.
Well deserving with a good question. Yeah.
Yeah, good question.
Awesome. All right, Allison, we'll reach out to you. We have your email. I think we have your address too, so we'll just ship it to you. Again, Caroline, thank you so much for joining. This has been awesome. It's been really cool to learn about something most of us probably aren't very exposed to, but it is relevant to what we do. So this was just super cool. Thanks again.
Thank you for inviting, and thanks everyone.
Thank
All right.
you.
See you, everybody.